So joining me for today's conversation is my doctoral professor, Dr. Rick Langer, and I want to have this conversation to continue something that started in class. So if you go back last month, we're gathered together for our classes this year, and he brings up this idea of testing teachings versus torching teachers. And ultimately, how are we responding in this very polarized society that we live in? And ultimately, kind of, for me as an apologist, here's what hit me, and here's what I want to talk about. As an apologist, it's easy to think that I just need the right arguments or the right evidence to persuade someone and make a persuasive case, and that people should be persuaded because people are mainly just following the evidence wherever it leads. And if the other side disagrees, it's because they just haven't seen my argument, or they haven't seen my case, or they haven't seen something. And we often talk about how that's not true, but sometimes it comes out in the way that we talk, and then we think the other side just needs some philosophical education. And Dr. Rick Langer in his class kind of laid out this case of maybe the problem that we have is not as much philosophical as it is sociological. Maybe there are some problems in the heart, problems in the mind that is causing this polarization and divisiveness. And if we kind of apply some habits that we're going to talk about today, maybe we can actually stand firm for truth, but do so while still loving our neighbor as Scripture calls. And so that's going to be the topic of today's conversation. I'm looking forward to it. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show geared to train you to think well about the faith and the culture. And as I mentioned, today we're having a conversation with my doctoral professor, Dr. Rick Langer. Dr. Langer, thanks for coming on and joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. I'm really looking forward to being with you.
Yeah, we've had a lot of chance to chat in class and talk about a lot of stuff. And I wanted to have you on the show for quite some time, and just busyness of schedules and different things happening. It just hasn't happened. But when you address this in class, I said, hey, if I get this book and get this chapter, it comes from a larger book. Here's the larger book, QAnon, Chaos, and the Cross, Christianity and Conspiracy Theories, where he wrote this one chapter. I said, hey, if I get the book, will you talk with me about it? And you agreed so graciously. So maybe let's just start here at the beginning. This idea, testing teachings versus and torching teachers, kind of where did this come from? And what are you trying to help people think through in this big picture idea of this chapter?
Yeah, well, so here's the interesting thing about this. When I remember having a conversation when I was in seminary, this is like 40 years ago. And I'm sitting here chatting with a couple of guys, and the one guy just talks about this issue. He's telling about it's a mess at the church he was a part of, and people just really mean, destructive things with the relationships. And one of the other guys said, well, they're probably just trying to test the teaching. And the friend made this observation. He says, yeah, but you're supposed to test the teaching, not torch the teacher. And he was speaking that out of feeling like the guy who was getting torched. You could almost see his mental image of his hair on fire. And I realized, that's a really good point. And then I got to thinking about this, and I thought there's actually a little bit more deeper stuff going on in that than I thought. And one of the weird things that happens is torching a teacher actually becomes a replacement for testing a teaching. Yeah. It sounds like I've really thought this through, and therefore I've got some things I need to say about this guy. And, that's what we think is going on. But usually what's happened is, for whatever reason, they pushed the button that got on the wrong side of you or your group. And now you're just flaming at the person. And the weird thing is you never actually engage the substance of their teaching. The torching is a replacement for the testing. And that's a really bad trade-off.
Yeah. So let's just start maybe with a more obvious question of why is it important for us to test teachings? Why not just say, hey, I'll let you believe what you want to believe. Let's agree to disagree. Like, why is the testing of a teaching important for Christians today?
Yeah. So this would be a good thing to talk about. And I imagine you have a few thoughts on this as well. But one of the things that, this is obvious, but because we know there's false teaching. And therefore you realize, we need to be discerning because there's bad stuff out there. I don't know if you've had the experience of going to it could be anywhere, Home Depot somewhere, and you have a $50 bill, and they'll take that bill and they'll put some kind of a weird marker thing on it that only shows up, that only is transparent on a real bill. And if it's a non-real bill, it leaves some kind of a mark. I don't know what it is, because I always pass the real bills. But the bottom line is they know immediately. I'm not good enough to know immediately without further investigation this is real or if this is counterfeit. So let me do a testing process. And in this case, they kind of have the magic marker thing that does it. But it's that awareness that there's bad stuff out there, and this is big enough. Like I say, it's when you give them a 20, maybe. If you give them a $50 or $100 bill, for sure, they're checking that thing out, because that's a fairly important thing, and they want to make sure they've gotten it right. So that's the first reason we should be testing and teaching. The second one's a little bit more subtle, a little more spiritual. There's just a little slice of being honest about perhaps the doctrine of total depravity, which says not only does sin affect our moral being, it affects our mental being. So total depravity has a deleterious effect on our reasoning capacities. Our sin taints our ability to reason. That doesn't mean we can't reason. It doesn't mean we can't find truth. But it does mean we should always be a little bit of suspicion about our own ability to test a teaching all on our own. Because if it corresponds with our own biases, if it comes from a person we happen to know or like, if it's a handy teaching for some reason, we won't give it a real test. And so testing should be an intentional project, but also, generally speaking, a corporate project. In other words, it's good to chew on it with somebody else and say, well, wait a minute, this is what this person's reading. Here's how I read it. I'm not sure if I got it right. And you remember this in class. For those who aren't in the class that I'm doing with Ryan, these guys read 3,000 pages worth of books before they show up. And then we're talking through what did we read. And I don't know about you. I mean, I don't want to give away too many secrets about how we read things, but we don't always read things as carefully as we should. And I would hate for the first person who spoke up about some particular thing we read in class to be the last word on what's going on there. And you remember some of the conversations we've had where people start off in one direction. It's like, well, wait a minute, did you think about this? And you're like, oh, I never thought about that at all. Or that isn't the impression I had. And all of those things, those are healthy things. That isn't a bad sign. It's a good sign, but it does reinforce the fact that we kind of need one another, and we need to create cultures where testing a teaching is not only okay, it's like a desired thing to do.
Yeah.
I think those are some of the things that make me I'm a fan of testing teaching. It doesn't offend me when somebody wants to test mine. And I think we want to cultivate places where we really say, hey, let's bring this up for investigation.
Well, I think that story you shared from class is me. I was the one that didn't like that one book, and it was instantly made aware. And everyone might have caused me to see that book a little bit differently, which is good.
It's interesting, because I think the thing to remember with that is how much sense it made for you when some of this came up, to say that can't be right. And you're picking up on something that's really true. But the point is, have I seen what the person's really saying, or do I know what else is going on behind the scenes? How can you know all this stuff? We really can't. And I wouldn't want to put that burden on any individual.
Yeah.
But to say, create environments where it's just welcome to be tested. And it's not the end of the world to be wrong, or to say I'm half wrong, because that's usually what you find out. Usually you're not like just completely missed everything, but you're like, oh, there's some things I missed. And yeah, that's part of the game. It's a good thing. Yeah.
Okay. So if we're going to talk about not torching teachers, but what if we test an idea and find that idea is false, that teacher is a false teacher? So in this idea of what does it mean to not torch them? And is there room for calling out false teachers in that?
Yeah, so this is a really easy distinction to make, would be between a mistaken teacher and a false teacher. So a teacher who makes a mistake, I mean, I'm a teacher by vocation. Are you thinking for the last 40 years I've never made a mistake? I've never said anything that's wrong. I would never assume that. The point with a person who makes a mistake is mistakes are correctable and they're willing to be corrected. The false teacher is committed to their error. So they are arguing for it. They are resisting change, or resisting the counter, the counter push. So this whole thing about testing teaching, part of what you want to do when you find out, I think this is wrong, the next thing you do is to try and bring it forward to the person, or, maybe an advocate of a position or whatever, but to say, hey, here's what I'm seeing here. And then you discover am I butting up against somebody I want to call a false teacher? Because they're kind of a technical thing in the New Testament, right? A false teacher is a thing, and it's not a good thing. On the other hand, you have people like in the book of James, where he's just talking about be careful about teaching. Be careful about what you say, because your little spark can set a whole forest on fire. But in that context, I don't think he's talking to people the way you would find it, for example, in 2 Peter, where he's writing a letter to false teachers. That's the best word to describe them. They are heretical false teachers. James is probably talking about kind of just all of us, the mistakes we make and the caution we need to have about what we say. So again, arbitrary terms perhaps, but distinguish mistaken teachers and false teachers. And you want to think, if you're saying, what do I do when I found something's wrong? The first thing you want to figure out, which of the two am I talking to?
Yeah.
Because the mistaken teacher, you're saying, okay, let me say, and what you want to have is an open to reason sort of conversation. With the false teacher, I think there's a different kind of a posture where you really are looking to clarify, are you committed to a heresy? And even then, a spirit of gentleness or things like that. These are things commanded in the New Testament. And as you look through there, it's like, 2 Timothy chapter 2, Timothy's being exhorted by Paul. He says, man, you want to be able to correct these false teachers, but you want to do it in the spirit of gentleness. And he applies it to people who've, quote, been captured by Satan to do his will. My gosh, that's bad stuff, right? But he's saying even in that context, lovingness, gentleness are in play, but you're probably looking more to lay bare the error and make it clear to all, for the sense of almost encouraging people to be distanced from that, or perhaps that they repent, because that's always the hope that Paul's holding for. That's great. But a lot of times what we've done is we mistake a mistaken teacher for a false teacher. Because what they said isn't right or isn't right by our standards. We don't take the time to think about, is this an issue that Christians legitimately divide over? So that doesn't make them a false teacher if they're still teaching orthodoxy, but a different bent on it. They teach infant baptism, I teach believers baptism. Most people don't define that as a heresy. In fact, my denomination, the Evangelical Free Church, individual churches can practice both. Either is fine within the free church. That's just a thing that we have chosen to say is not a thing we divide over. So the false teachers are things, these are where we divide a line, and this is where we, they are on the other side of Christian orthodoxy. Within Christian orthodoxy, there's usually a variety of opinions. Some of those things are things you'll genuinely say are mistaken teaching. It's fine to talk about those and identify, hey, you say this, I say that. It makes a lot more sense to me this way. Talk to me about that. Tell me the backstory of that, because I don't see where you're coming from. Those are great conversations, and I would argue that you can have those in a very congenial fashion if you're willing and interested.
So how does that look different than what you're thinking of when you talk about torching teachers? What is that?
Well, so let me just read a little thing I gave from a blog post that was in that article. But someone wrote a blog post recommending that you should get a COVID vaccine as an act to love your neighbor. And the point of the blog, it was a short, simple blog post. And they're really just saying, don't just think of your own interests, but you may be a person who's not very worried about getting COVID. And so you don't really care that much about it. You're not rushing out to go get a vaccine. But this person's point was, look, there's people who can't get a vaccine at all. They're really worried about it. Because of public health things, we can't get back to business as usual. This is a few years ago, and we can't get back to just normal meeting and things like that unless people are getting vaccines. It's just, how about if we just do some of these things that would make it easier to get back into normal life? That was his line of argument. And again, that's entirely debatable, right? That's a thing that I think Christians can disagree over. I can totally understand why a person might disagree with that. But let me read some of the responses that popped up on the Facebook page or whatever page it was from this. One person said, what next? Love thy neighbor and get an abortion. It's about the same level of logic. Another person said, oh, awesome insight on scripture. Every time the New Testament says the word love, we should translate it, get the shot. Another person said, vacuous virtue signaling, unfactual, uninformed, logical fallacies, bad hermeneutics. Another person said, boo, Why take a stance like this? You know it's all political, right? And you know the shot, the shot doesn't work. Now, and there's, trust me, there's plenty of others. And I don't want to take the time to point out fallacies within these or stuff like that. I'm just saying, you notice what's happened is they're flaming against the teacher, and the teaching itself remains untested. In other words, they're not stopping and saying, well, wait a minute, is this really a good plan? Is this the best way to help our neighbor? What about people who say that they will only go back to church if everybody else is either wearing a mask or vaccinated? Is that fair? Is that right? We could talk about a million things thoughtfully about this argument, but I looked at all these responses, and this was sort of the prevailing ethos of responses. And I thought, the interesting thing is people have flamed because they obviously were people who were, anti-vaccine, but their response was not to give reasoned responses. It wasn't a James chapter 3 thing about wisdom from above that's open to reason, impartial, and sincere. That's not what you're getting. You're getting people who are flaming. They're torching the teacher. And the irony is that exact act keeps them from ever seriously testing the teaching or helping another person. Maybe they see it super clearly. Wouldn't it be great in that context to give, hey, here's 3 reasons, or here's 3 things I don't think this person thought about? But instead you get the flaming and you get the torching. Yeah. And I would argue that's become kind of commonplace in the last 6 or 8 years. I think because of polarization politically. I think it's partly because of social media. I think of how many of these individuals would have said those exact same words to this person's face.
Right.
There's a way we talk on social media because we're not face to face that lets us do flaming and torching really easily. And unfortunately, that keeps us from doing the valuable testing. Yeah. And so all of those are the things that make me worried about. That's what I mean when I say the torching. It's an attitude, it's a flaring, and it almost always is very, very thin on reasoning. Even if a person has good reasons, those reasons remain unexpressed, or a reader will not hear those reasons because of the emotion it's expressed with.
Yeah. So one of the things then that stuck with me in classes we talked about this is that most people, you have a PhD in philosophy. So as philosophers, apologists, you think, okay, there's a bunch of logical fallacies in these responses that people are giving. They clearly are not figuring out how to test the teaching. Maybe it's because they don't have enough philosophical training. We just need to give them more philosophy, more logic, more critical thinking, and then they won't be talking like this. This won't be an issue. And instead you said, no, I don't think it's a philosophical problem. I think it is more sociological. Can you what kind of led you to this conclusion of maybe it's not a philosophy issue, but maybe it's more sociology?
Yeah. Well, so the analogy I used in class, I think, was of the park that's down the street from my house.
Right.
That apparently has become the official Fullerton dog park. I mean, who knew? But apparently that's it. So you go down there, there's all these people and all these dogs, and the dogs are all running off their leash. And you're thinking, by golly, what Fullerton needs is some good leash laws. Well, if you go up there, you look, you'll find A, Fullerton does have leash laws, and B, the park actually has a sign right there saying, keep your dog on a leash. And you look behind it, here's 30 people with all their dogs, and none of them are on a leash. And you're like, oh, Fullerton doesn't have a leash law problem. It doesn't have a dog problem. It has a people problem. It has a master problem, not a dog problem, because these dogs all have masters who all have leashes. So it's a question of there's some other thing going on. And the interesting thing is the dogs down there are actually remarkably well behaved. I've never had any problems with them. It's a place where friendly dogs go and they actually run off the leash. And by and large, it seems to work okay. I'm not planning on calling animal control to get this operation shut down in the near future. But it's easy to think when you see all these things off, you've got a law problem, you've got a leash problem, and you realize, no, it's actually a people problem. And it's kind of a social thing that's happened where this park is where a bunch of people congregate because it really is a bunch of things. And the dogs seem to get along largely fine. Okay, so what do we have? You think it's a leash problem? It's not. Well, this is a similar thing, I think, with our philosophical testing of ideas. Most people I talk to, are pretty good with getting the logic of A implies B and B implies C. Therefore, A will automatically apply C. They can do modus tollens and modus ponens and these other things mentally because they're logical intuitions we have. There are challenges with that. There's evidence, there's complexities to reasoning, but most of us have enough to do that. But we don't seem to use it. And that's what got me thinking, why is it that I read so many arguments that seem unused? They seem to not use the philosophical chops that they do have. And that's what got me thinking about the sociology side. So here's an easy way to think about it. You get some teaching, maybe your group is really organized around, we want no gun control. We hate these restrictions. We have promises of a Second Amendment to have guns and all this. And so, yeah, that's a big thing. We're all gun people. And this is your group of your 8 or 10 best friends. You go hunting with these guys. They're part of your church. They're part of your Bible study group, but this is part of your thing. And then you read something about Canada or Australia that has different gun laws. They do have, people can buy guns, but there's a lot more restrictions and things like that. And they have a lot less gun deaths. And you're like, that's interesting. That pushes back against my teachings, my bent on this. What should I do with this? Should I talk to my friends and say, hey, I just read this article. Let's read this together and see, because this is really different than what we think. And that would be an example saying, okay, let's test the teaching and let's test it in my social group. And the question is, how would that go over in your group? And the weird thing is, for many of us, that would not go over well. If you hang out with people who are staunch Trump supporters and you're suddenly say, hey, Biden made this good point, doesn't tend to go over well. Likewise, the opposite way. A bunch of Biden supporters who are super progressive and say, hey, Trump really came out with some good stuff. We should say, attaboy when he does a good thing. You'll find that your group oftentimes pushes back strongly against that. Not just because you don't even have to argue in favor of it. Simply bringing it up for inspection makes people look at you and say, are you really one of us? Are you really part of the group? And that's the moment when you realize, how much do I care about testing a teaching? Let me do the cost-benefit analysis. If I test this teaching, discover that it's actually right, and it's clarification or modification or a conflict with some of my treasured values that my group holds, I will increase the quality of my mental life by 5% or some magic number like that. So, should I test the teaching? Well, that'd be the payoff, this incremental increase in my mental, acuity, so to speak. What's the downside? What's the cost of it? You'll lose standing in the group that you have all of your treasured friends with, who you worship with, who you relax with, who are the friends of your friends. You will suddenly be on the outside looking in. Which do you want? A 5% increase in your mental abilities or your mental clarity, or do you want to lose all your friends? You choose. Most of us suddenly say, I think I'll choose to keep all my friends.
Yeah.
That's a bit of brute fact human psychology. There are exceptions to that, but they're pretty rare.
Yeah.
And the problem then is the sociological one, because I'm saying the problem in this whole story is not that you bring a teaching, you are worried. It's not that you can't bring up the teaching. It's that you do that with the fear of losing your sociology, your social group. And my worry is not that you, on that fear, don't make the hard choice saying, I've got to take the hard thing. My worry is that we've created groups that are resistant to willingness to test teachings. They don't even want contrary teachings brought up. That's my key. And that's why I call it a sociological problem. Because I understand why you chicken out, so to speak, if you're going to lose all your friends. And how do you get a new batch? I mean, it's not an easy trade-off. So I get all of that. But what I want to do is point my finger then and say, we need to work on our groups. We have a sociological problem before we have a philosophical problem.
Yeah.
And so we need to develop groups that have toleration for teaching, have interest in teaching. And this is just what I was talking about, like with our D-Min group. to be able to say, you know what, guys, we want to welcome this. And we're not going to run somebody out of town because they make a mistake. We're going to celebrate people who raise issues. And even if the issue turns out to be false, say, that was a really good question, though, because all of us are now thinking better about this issue because you raised that point. So we're going to welcome those different viewpoints. We're going to invite all of this and make people feel, good and welcome in that context. So that's the I'm looking for.
Yeah, and I've seen this clearly in my work. I had a high school student tell me, if I admit that God exists, then my friends will look at me differently. And so it's not and Frank Turek brings this up all the time. And it's, I think, a good question is that when atheists are debating with him, he'll stop and say, like, if I could prove to you that Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? And I've used that question many times because how many times I've gotten that answer where it's like, well, no, or maybe, I don't know. And it's like, so even if I could prove it's true, and you're saying you're still not going to become a Christian, there's got to be something else going on in you, personal, emotional, volitional, sociological, something else than simply we just need better philosophy. We need a better argument because we recognize we are emotional beings and we're driven by our emotions. And even some of us who go, I'm an apologist, I stand by the truth, I follow the truth wherever it leads, recognize that we still have emotions. Because like you brought up a convenient, I'm going to ask you about convenient truths, but you talk about convenient truths in here of truths that we never test because it agrees with something we like. And in the margin of the book, I wrote, I wrote 3 to 4 cups of coffee. So I remember I was drinking a ton of coffee, way more than I am now. And you know how much I drink coffee now, sitting in class with me all day. But back in the day, I was drinking even more. And I remember finding an article that popped up somewhere and said, drinking 3 to 4 cups of coffee a day is good for you. And I just read that title and I went, awesome. And I remembered that and I stuck it away and I go, okay, what I'm doing is great for me. And I guarantee you if that thing said drinking 3 to 4 cups a day is bad for you, I would have just dismissed it. Bad study. That's wrong. I'm going to keep doing what I do. But I found something that agrees with what I want to do. I never tested it. I never looked at the evidence. And I just went, yep, there it is. I like it. And I now repeat that claim sometimes, now with the caveat of I never actually looked into this. It's more of a joke in which I repeat it, but I repeat it. And I've been to conferences and churches where I've literally been told, don't bring X theological point up because if you do, that could be a big issue. And it's debatable stuff like eschatology, or don't tell someone you're an old earth creationist, or don't tell someone you're an amillennialist, or don't tell someone that you reject the rapture, or don't tell someone that because if you do, that could create a problem. And so that is the question of what are we saying, not only just about individuals who get upset at me because I say, look, you can be an old earth creationist, you can be a young earth creationist, no big deal, pick one. And I have students that get upset. But what does it also say about churches or groups of people that if a speaker on a stage simply says, I don't think there's a rapture, we have to be like, hey, please don't mention this view that you hold because it could create a problem. I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. So, I don't know if you had something, if I just cut you off.
No, I mean, I agree. I think that is one of the tensions. And it's one of the things I want to say is with churches, I don't mind when people have publicly declared a particular, what you might call sub-orthodoxy. So this is a defining position of our group, as long as we do it really transparently. So everybody who's in the group knows this is the group. And even then, once you've done that, you want to be understanding to say, yes, I understand Christians in good faith can disagree on this point. Right. But the point is, this is what defines a group. Those kind of boundaries work great. And I'm happy to have groups be, narrow around a sub-orthodoxy, have that be a requirement for either, church leadership or even church membership, depending on what the issue is. But I worry when those become not sub-orthodoxies, but shadow orthodoxies. The thing that is never stated, but we're going to enforce it through the social mechanism of ostracizing, alienating, not including, whatever it might be. And you're like, but this doesn't violate. I looked at your membership covenant. I looked at your statement. There's nothing I said that's wrong with that. Yeah, but you have to vote for this person. You can't really be here if you think this should happen with immigration or that should happen with immigration. We pick up these kinds of issues. And that was a big thing with the COVID. It's less so now, but the COVID vaccine and COVID masking were remarkably alienating issues like that. And no one had that built into their doctrinal statements. But it became shadow orthodoxies, and they created shadow divisions. And these are these areas I want to say, I think we need to be the kind of social group, so to speak, that love is bigger than those kinds of shadow orthodoxies. And
Yeah.
if we do have an orthodoxy, let's make it clear and take it out of the shadows. And if we don't, let's give grace to the people who are on the other side of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. I'm with you there, where I don't have an issue with groups choosing doctrines that they want to say, here's what we believe in. I guess what I'm thinking of is when I come into a group having a different belief than that group publicly declares that they do have, for them to then say kind of like, hey, don't let anyone be aware that you disagree here, because that could be problematic. And so it's like, we have to almost present this a front or this image as if every person coming in holds to everything we do. And if they realize that you disagree on something, that actually creates a problem, versus like, oh, interesting, you think differently than our church thinks on this. Can we talk about that? And can we kind of figure it out? And I think that's the healthy way to do it. So you talk about in this book, right? You address, and as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of habits of the mind, habits of the heart, or in this chapter, on how to kind of confront this. And what we're talking about here is habits of the mind. And the first thing you talk about here is, that dog leash problem. If it's not a dog problem, it's not a law problem. It's not even a leash problem. Don't just go buy more leashes. They have leashes, right? There's something else going on. And you talk about this idea of convenient truths. And you define a convenient truth as something that is, fits nicely with our pre-existing beliefs. It's immediately welcomed into our thinking. It's quickly repeated to our friends and our neighbors, both digitally and in person. It also exempts from testing. And so when it's convenient, like I said, with the coffee thing, I don't test it. I don't see if that's actually true. I just go, hey, it fits what I like. And I immediately accept it, and I start to repeat it. My question, I guess, for you, and what you kind of ask here, or you come back to the dog thing. I think this is great too, because you said it's kind of like the rules. We have rules with ideas, like we have rules for dogs, where if it's nice, let it run free, and if it's a mean dog, then you put it on a leash. And that's why I couldn't figure out what to put on the thumbnail of this video. And I put like, bad ideas that run free or something like that. Where it's like, I think we sometimes aren't testing it. And we go, well, it looks nice on the outside. This looks like a good idea. And so, hey, let it spread, versus bad ideas we want leashed down. And so my question is that you ask here is, why are we so prone to let convenient truths serve as this, convenient serve as the exemption to test it? Why are we so quick to just say, hey, that fits, I don't need to test it? Why aren't we testing things a little bit better, do you think?
I think there's a philosophical reason and a sociological reason on this. I mean, it's an interesting question to think about. The philosophical reason, there's technical terms for things like confirmation bias and things like that. So when you believe something, it's very easy to accept things that reinforce your existing belief and have them kind of just be deposited in the category of collaborative evidence. This is one thing that reinforces my disposition anyhow. And we ask the question basically of a thing like that, can I believe this? And if the answer is yes, you can believe it. In other words, it's not, a bizarre thing of I believe that dinosaurs still live in Cleveland. I'm like, no, dinosaurs don't live in Cleveland. They might have once upon a time. They don't live there anymore, So I can't believe that. But your thing about 3 cups of coffee being helpful is like, oh, I can believe it. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to believe, at least on the surface of it. There's nothing crazy about it. Those things drop into this pot of collaborative evidence. So they reinforce a belief. They may not be the foundation. If that was going to be the foundation of your belief, you might have wanted to do more work. But you already had a belief, you already had a disposition, this drops in, it's great. So this is kind of you call it psychological, call it philosophical, but whatever, what you might call philosophical psychology. The psychology of our belief is such that happens. We collect things that way. And if you're going to have to do disconfirmation, you never ask the question, can I believe this disconfirming piece of evidence? But rather you ask the question, must I believe it? Is there any way I could avoid believing it? And you begin to think about that as a level of, truth testing. Like, is there any way you can avoid believing it? I'm like, well, my gosh, if you really want to avoid believing things, you can avoid believing almost anything, right? And so that gap between what do we do with confirmation bias and then the negative disconfirming bias, that gap is enormous. So that's one thing that's really tricky. When it's convenient, it falls into that gap space and it gets sucked in untested by and
Yeah.
large. The sociological part of that is it's really cool if you've got another buddy who loves coffee too. It's like you call him up. I mean, you're just instantly motivated to get 3 cups, get 4. I'm going to get a bigger mug. I mean, you're just like, man, this is perfect. And you get all this emotional, social, relational juice out of it. And you laugh and smile. It's all great. And so, yeah, off we go. And both of those give momentum to these convenient truths.
So in my devotions this morning, I'm reading in Matthew, and there's the part of, don't take the speck out of your brother's eye until you first remove the log out of your own. It just seems like there's some truth here of just how easy it is to judge others and be critical of others or skeptical of others and not of ourselves, where, I think of, when I read something from an atheist online, it's so easy to see how he maybe is grabbing at evidences or twisting things out of context or not testing things. And I found this article that proves my point. And it's like, but did you read the article? Because it actually says something different. And it's easy to see how others do it. And it's very hard to recognize when we do it ourselves. Is there kind of a little bit of that, like wanting to point out the faults in others, but not think that we have it ourselves? How do we reverse that and say, hey, I first want to make sure I'm doing this well, so that I can then point it out in others as well, so we can all be better at testing things.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And I think one of the things is developing a curiosity about people's beliefs, which is so different than saying I'm going to agree with them.
Yeah.
But to say, why do they believe that? And we do this sometimes when we hear about like a tribal culture in the Amazon where they don't use the word left and right, but they use absolute coordinates. So north, south, east, and west. And we in the West are terrible. I know all kinds of people who couldn't tell north, south, east, where they're walking around on campus or in their house and asking, what's the north wall of your house? They have no idea. They just don't think that way. But we're really good with right and left. But these other cultures, some of them have like these incredible abilities to mentally track the compass directions. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. And we're curious about how does that work? And you can almost feel us leaning in to find out more, though I doubt we're really saying we're planning on converting to compass orientation rather than this person sitting on my left or this person sitting on my right, because we're looking like, what good would it do me in classroom? Say, yeah, Ryan's sitting to the east of me. Everyone would be going, so we're not going to use that. We're not going to go that way. But at the same time, we're intrigued by that. And that's the thing that I think we could stand to learn a little bit from people who are really sympathetic to viewpoints that we really disagree with. Why are you progressive? Why are you conservative? Why are you this way? And what's so common so I've kind of worked on cultivating some of this intentionally partly because you sense your own lack in some of that. It is uncanny the interesting stories I hear. This is one of my favorites, is relative to vaccines, and you have to understand this is before COVID. So there was no COVID vaccine when this happened. So this is a traditional old version of vaccines. When vaccines were a non-issue, nobody cared about them. And I was in a faculty discussion group with a person, and we identified the issues that we, as a group, most disagreed on. I went to like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party platforms, listed out what they said, and had people kind of identify, 1 to 7, what do you agree with or disagree with on this? So I identified what we disagree about. Healthcare policy was one of them. How do you feel about the affordable healthcare plan or something like that? So we said, okay, we're going to talk about that. So first person goes who's really opposed. This person's really opposed to the affordable healthcare plan. And I was thinking they liked insurance. They were afraid that they would not be able to get access, blah, 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 whatever it was. Turns out this person has an issue with vaccines, and they are really concerned about government inclusion because what happened was their daughter, in effect, the nephews and nieces of the family, so direct relatives to him, had really severe reactions to vaccines. I mean, life-threatening ones that were really problematic, and so they didn't want to vaccinate their kids. And the local school boards here are like, well, you have to vaccinate your kids or your kids can't come to school here. And they're like, yeah, but this happened to my nieces and nephews. And it's like, yeah, well, has it happened to your kids? I'm like, well, no, but like, I don't want my kid to get anaphylactic shock. I don't want my kid to do, yeah. Well, and the bottom line was this person, his wife had to give up her career. She ended up homeschooling. They've had all kinds of problems with this stuff because of this issue with, again, 5 years ago, vaccine kind of issues. And I had never, ever even thought of that. And that he had an anxiety about increasing government involvement in healthcare in general made a stunning amount of sense to me once I understood his backstory.
Yeah.
Now, did I end up agreeing with everything? No, I didn't. I didn't actually end up changing my opinions about my belief, but I have ended up being much more interested when I hear someone being anti-vax in this more traditional sense in particular to say, tell me your story. And it turned out we had two people in this group, relatively small group, who had had similar experiences like that. And I was just like, I never knew. I just never. So curiosity is one of the best cures for this. And never think because you're curious, you're asking non-judgmental questions. Tell me more. How did it feel when that happened? So you're telling me your wife gave up her career. Has that been okay for you guys? That you actually lean into some of those things is a thing that we commonly don't do. And I think that's really a key thing for, creating an atmosphere where you can actually do a little bit better thinking about the contrary teachings.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. Yeah, that is so good. Cause I think, a lot of this is what I want to be getting at towards the end is this, what we do heart-wise and practical steps. And that is one great application there instantly. One more thing you talk about here in the section of habits of the mind is inconvenient teachers. And I like what you say here is you talk about an inconvenient teacher is not someone who teaches something different. In fact, that person is actually very convenient for your group. You mentioned, Nancy Pelosi is very convenient with conservatives. If she says anything crazy, then conservatives are like, yeah, and they're sharing and retweeting. Look what she says. Same thing. Trump is very convenient for progressives. When he does something crazy, it's like, look what Trump did. Instead, you define an inconvenient teacher as the ones whose names I probably don't even know, but these are the thoughtful, sober-minded, reasonable defenders of a truth claim I don't like. And so when it comes to inconvenient teachers, people who are thoughtful and reasonable people on the other side, what should we do with them? What do we do with this knowledge of inconvenient teachers out there?
Well, so one of the things that has hit me that I have learned some things on from this is that your first thought about an inconvenient teacher is that they actually have something to teach you. And it isn't, again, so much that they will be correcting you, because I'm not assuming there's a bunch of your convictions that are really on the table here, but your reasoning, your defense of the account you give of your own convictions can be radically improved by sincerely listening to your critics and suddenly going, wait a minute, I'm defending this thing all the wrong way. I'm not, approaching this right. I think of you, Ryan, with doing apologetics stuff. I'm older than you are. I grew up in a Francis Schaeffer era. I grew up in postmodern thought was happening when I was coming of age in college and in graduate school, but it wasn't the prevailing ethos. So we had a pretty modern world arguing for truth, testing truth, using reason, logic, that kind of thing. That had a lot of punch. You fast forward 30 years, and we've gotten to a point where there's a much bigger role to be played for aesthetics in apologetics. And not that I want to say who cares about truth, but the point is I don't want to say who cares about beauty. I want to say beauty matters. Beauty is compelling to us as human beings, and we've moved into a place where those sorts of things are more likely to move the needle for people than they were when I was in college in the 70s. Does that make one group right or wrong? I'm just making observations about what moves the needle for people. And I hear people pushing back on things with my traditional orientation on stuff. I'm going, why don't they get it? I've given them the really good arguments. And suddenly I listen to a thoughtful advocate for a more aesthetic approach to issues in general. They may not agree with any of my stuff, but they make this point about how compelling elegance is, even scientifically. And I'm like, oh, an elegant isn't a tight logical observation. You can feel the aesthetic side to a judgment that that is an elegant proof, that E equals MC squared. It just has this elegance to it in scientific language. It gives it a certain believability. It doesn't prove it, but it makes you go, wow, if that is explaining things, that's pretty powerful. So those are some of the things that happen when you begin to listen to critics, is you say, oh, maybe there's a bit of a sea change going on this issue, and I'm arguing for a position the way I needed to argue 10 years ago, but I'm missing everybody who's come of age, so to speak, in the last 10 years, because they're seeing this issue in a different context. I'm stuck in my past. How do I learn that? Not by talking to my buddies who agree with me, but by talking to a thoughtful, reasonable person on the other side who makes them say, oh, that's why this person's unmoved by my arguments. I need to begin thinking, not so much rethinking as broadening my thinking about my own position. What are other approaches I might take to give an account? And sometimes, sure, you discover you are in error, but I don't like to lead with that because that isn't really my key motive with this. I want better discourse. I want better truth testing. And I want us to be able to give better accounts of our convictions. That's the thing that my buttons.
So what encouragement would you give to someone who says, well, yeah, but I want to search out those people. I want to find those inconvenient teachers that I can learn something from, but I'm nervous because if my group that I'm in finds out, right, then my friends would be upset. They would see this as an act of betrayal. And I am making that social calculus and saying, hey, my group versus this one thing being tested and realizing this one thing is false. What encouragement would you give to someone who says, I do want to seek those people out, but I'm worried?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think we underestimate is the power that you can have to influence your own existing group. It's funny the things that you can do that can move the needle a little bit within your group. And that's one of the things I want to say. You are a steward of the ethos of your in-group. And if you don't think it's the way it really needs to be, I would really encourage you to have the courage, not necessarily to just speak up like you can argue people's differently, to start thinking, what could I do to model a different approach in a way that might move the needle for some of the other people in the group? Let me just not passively accept the closed-mindedness that we might show, or the way we just run ragged over people when we get a convenient truth of someone else's, stupid opinion. I think it's a good thing to stop and say, what can I do to move the needle a bit for my existing group?
Yeah.
The other thing that can happen is that sometimes you realize my group is kind of bad for me. It reinforces the worst parts of me. And I'm not going to, dissociate myself from everybody, but I need to find some other people in my life who foster some of my better side, because I realize that the only thing I'm getting reinforced is, this group of people's perspectives. I'm going to become more and more like that. And that isn't really a win.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are some of the.
That's good. And I appreciate that. We're coming up on an election, and it just seems like there's almost no topic as big as politics at doing this. There's other things. I mentioned drinking coffee and finding my convenient truths, but really that's kind of more trivial. But really, I can post a lot of stuff online and I get pushback from atheists or whatever. It's a Christian thing. But man, if I post something on LGBTQ issues or something like that, it just, right, the torching just comes full blast. And there are theological issues as well that this happens. I've been torched theologically as well by certain individuals. But it seems like maybe theology, politics are the big ones. And so I'm curious kind of what do you think it is? What is it about politics, and maybe theology and politics, that draws people who maybe are normally truth-seeking individuals to actually favor kind of a tribalism over truth, or do you think it's something else? Like, why these issues and why? Because these people in every area, the other area of their life, they are seeking truth. But when it comes to this, it seems like tribalism or the sociological factors just have so much more of a pull.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that has happened in the last 10 to 15 years, and now I'm talking for Christians in particular, is I think background fear levels have just elevated. And let me explain a little bit about what I mean. Biola went through a thing, I don't know, 8 years ago or so, where they were in effect trying to get a legislation through Sacramento that would have kept us from being able to take Cal grants and Pell grants. So these are grants that the federal government gives because they want people to go to college, and so they give them some money to do it, but they don't give the money to the college. They give the money to the individual to get the education at the college of their choice. And it's a lot like incentive things for getting people to buy homes, FHA loans or things like that are discounted or whatever. And they don't choose a home for you. The loan doesn't go to the person who's making the home or selling the home. It goes to the individual who's going to get the home. So the government isn't supporting anyone but the person who's actually getting this entity. So there's never been a problem with Pell Grants and things like that to go to a religious institution. That's just up to you. And it isn't the government's not funding the religious institution. They're funding the person who's going there. So that's how the U.S. has done business for decades. Well, suddenly this thing comes up in Sacramento that is like, oh, if you aren't in line with Sacramento teaching on LGBTQ issues, in this case, I think, so a variety of things in that area, we want to deny you the privilege of getting Pell Grants. You can imagine similar things happening to losing your nonprofit status. And that was a half an inch away from actually going through. And for Biola, that creates a bit of an existential crisis because you have a lot of students who are on grants, and getting a grant of $9,000, $10,000 a year can make a huge difference in terms of where a person can go to school. And would that shut our doors? I don't know. But the point is, it was a big deal. And as it turned out, that didn't actually happen. But it was only by the narrowest of margins. So those things begin to happen. And when you realize we're no longer living in a culture that views, not only that isn't sympathetic to Christianity, it is antagonistic. It views Christianity as fundamentally evil. And therefore, the things you do to evil people, you can't fund terrorists or things like that. You can't fund terrorists and Christians. You're beginning to get that kind of a feel. And that's what I mean about fear. It isn't we're just naturally fearful people or something, but there's the level of things we have to fear relative to our culture has been changing to the point where this is not an inconvenience. This becomes incompatible with our continued existence as an institution. What might happen with churches, some of the things that have gone. There's a bunch of those things where the magnitude has moved up, plus the general ethos of sexuality issues kind of being crammed, not just down our throats as adults, but to our kids, the things that they want to do with children in schools that we look at and go, I cannot believe that that's actually what people are saying should be done. So the stakes have elevated, and the intensity and the level, it isn't activists who are wanting to do this. This is our government people. These are our elected officials. This is our highest levels of government in the state of California or nationally. So those things elevate the fear. And I think we tacitly think we have a right to live in a time and place where the government is supportive of Christian values. Partly because for a person my age, at least most of my life, I have lived in that kind of a place. But the weird thing Christianly is to stop and go, wait a minute, why do I think that would be the case? Was that true in the New Testament? Was that true through most of church history? Is that true for most Christians today, that they live in a place that is supportive of Christian values? And the answer to that is just kind of no, no, and no. So it's great. I'm not a fan of saying, oh, let's just run and get persecution. But to realize that might come, I'm saying we need to have a little healthier view of that and a little less fear of, could we survive? Could the church survive and thrive in a difficult atmosphere? I'm like, as long as we think we can't, we're going to be super afraid of the next election or the next whatever it is, because it's an existential crisis for us. And I think that has made us suddenly elevate all these political issues are wildly important to us. And we get almost panicky important, because if this doesn't happen, we have an apocalyptic fear that the country will end as we know it.
Wow.
And Yeah, that's, I think, where we're living.
Yeah. So you talk about fear right there. So again, I'm reading in Matthew chapter 15, where Jesus tells the disciples, it's not what you eat, or not what comes out of you or what you eat, because that just comes out of you, but what comes out of the mouth, that is what matters. And they're like, we don't understand what you're talking about. And he's like, oh my goodness, how do you still not understand? And he says, don't you see that whatever goes in the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled, but what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this is what defiles a person. You talk about here in this chapter about this idea of habits of the heart. And if we're trying to develop new habits of the heart, and scripture tells us that what is coming out of our mouth is a reflection of our heart, what does it say about us when our hearts are prone to torch, are prone to divide, are prone to fight? What does that say about our hearts, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. So I think it says bad things. I think it should be a spiritual formation moment. And hopefully everybody who's a Christian has had moments in your life where you suddenly are confronted by the fact that I've got an attitude problem. Something's wrong for me. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was in India for when I was just post-college for a while as a missionary. And India is a pretty oppressive place to live in many ways. I had a wonderful time there, but it was hard. And one of them was the kind of a grinding poverty that's very much in your face. And so beggars are just a normal daily activity, and lepers as well. That, if you've never seen a leper before, to have a leper reaching out and pawing at you with hands that don't have fingers on them because they've been worn down. These are daily activities. And at first it was a shock. And then after 3 or 4 months of living there, we got used to it. And then you'd start to do these, casual things. So you'd have beggars would say, "Sob, sob," and they'd be, making this plea for you to give you money or get your attention or whatever. So we're sitting here at the breakfast table, and somebody else has got the tray down there, and there's some bananas on it, and you want a banana. So you go, instead of asking, "Hey, John, pass me a banana," you go, "Sob, banana." And you realize you're imitating these beggars. So anyhow, I did that one morning at breakfast. I went upstairs to have my devotional time, opened my Bible to Proverbs 17:5, that says, "He who mocks the poor insults his maker." And Ryan, I just want you to sit there and think for a minute about what I was just doing at that breakfast table and how I felt when I read that passage. I'm like, "Rick, you've got a problem." And it wasn't just this morning, that morning that I did it. Why in the world did I do that? Because I had drifted into a gutter, and our whole group, we all thought it was funny. I mean, we had all drifted into a place where mocking the poor seemed like a plausible thing to do for us. And I thought, that's not right. And I need to change. And I swear, today I feel like gentleness is the same way. To say, "Let me be gentle," is like, "Oh, right, ha, 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 snicker, snicker." I'm like, do you realize that's actually a fruit of the Spirit? Do you not care whether or not the fruit of the Spirit is emerging in your life? And if you don't like gentleness, how about kindness? How about patience? How about goodness? I worry that we can look at people who are modeling the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit and not even flinch. And we can be proud of our buddy or ourselves when we say very ungentle and unkind things to someone. And I'm like, that should be a real cautionary tale to us, that we need to wake up and say, "Wait a minute, I just need to change. That just is not right."
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a big deal to me.
Maybe I want to end with this because we just hit our time, but you talk about this, and I think I've been a part of a lot of groups, right? That will mock the other side, that mock different political groups, mock LGBTQ community, that really are mocking the other side. I've had parents talk to me about their kids or other individuals. As last year in class, I was studying gender identity, and I've shared this story a million times of, just people just making very simplistic, comments about the other side and just how ridiculous it is. And I think that we often think that there's this wide, narrow road of like, yeah, you test a teaching and there's a torching a teacher, and there's this wide middle ground where I can sit, where I can no, and almost defend the mocking of the other side. No, I'm testing the teaching. See that this teaching is crazy. Don't you realize how crazy it is? And it's like, yeah, we think we're testing these teachings and pointing out the ridiculous nature of something that the other side believes. But really it is not just simply testing. It is turning to a criticism, a torching, a mocking that is not following the fruits of the Spirit in our lives. And you talk about this in the beginning of your chapter of just how we often think that there's this wide middle ground of where I can sit in between in this nice middle space, this gray area, and be okay. When reality, maybe it's not as wide as we think. And the line between testing a teaching rightly and then turning to mocking and torching a teacher is actually a very thin line. Can you maybe just expand on that maybe slightly, or comment on that as we kind of finish up our time today?
Yeah. So I think when I wrote that, I was like, there should be a lot of room in here. This really shouldn't be that big a charge. But I do sense a bit of what you said, that it seems like it's easier to fall off that, or, cross over that line than we think. Martin Luther had this great line about, people, human beings in general, sinful human beings are like a drunk who is falling off his horse on the right side, pulls himself back up only to fall off on the left side. And it's like the one place he can't sit is in the saddle, and he has a whole saddle to hold him there. It shouldn't be that hard, but that's what we do. And I guess that's what I feel like. And I think some of it is that we live in a culture where we get a lot of positive energy from going relationally and emotionally, from going off to the extremes. And there's something mundane about the middle. And so I don't know what all the factors are, but yeah, I think the one thing I would say is maybe a better metaphor is to just think of a crowned road. If you drive down the highway in any modern city, you'll find the road isn't dead flat. It's crowned. The middle is higher than the edges because they want the water to drain off it, because otherwise you get a bunch of water standing on it and you hydroplane, you have accidents. So a crowned road is really, really helpful safety feature. But the side effect of it is you always have to tend your steering wheel a little bit, because when the road is crowned, if you just take your hands off, you'll automatically drift to a gutter, one or the other. And I think that's kind of what it's like when it comes to our social relationships and conversations. Always feel like a crowned road. And if you want to stay in the middle, you're always going to have to keep your hands on the wheel. It shouldn't have to be this big fighting, battle to keep you in the middle, but you have to tend it. You have to say it matters that I stay in my lane.
Yeah.
And I think that's the picture I would want to say is it isn't hopeless. It isn't nearly as difficult as you might imagine it to be. But if you don't intend it, it almost certainly won't happen by accident.
Yeah. It reminds me just of last night, my wife and I started an audiobook together that we're going to kind of listen through this book as we do some cleaning in the evening. And it's called like Habits of a Household. And one of the first things he said that really stuck with me is how many habits we develop throughout the day that are not actually because of something we've thought about. The things that we just do where, okay, we put the kids down for bed and we just sit down on the couch and start watching a show. It's like that you just do it because that's just what you do. But how many things do we just do without thinking about it? And how do we maybe stop and be a little bit more thoughtful of the habits that we have, so we realize about those things that we've done always that way, and we have kind of drifted off into something that's unhealthy, and we need to bring it back and steer it rightly, and then always be, like you said, always just be thoughtful, always be conscious to kind of make sure that we are still there and we're having and forming these good habits in our family, in our culture, in our friend group. And I think that is a good word of encouragement. So, well, thank you. We are over time, but thank you so much. I just have so been blessed by our conversations in class and the communication we've had throughout this program. And I'm thankful that I can bring you on here finally and let you bless and encourage anyone who is listening on podcasts, YouTube, radio, wherever you're listening. So Dr. Langer, thank you so much for joining the show today and talking with me about this.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It was really fun to come in and be able to be with you and all your viewers. Thanks much.
All right. Thank you. All right, everybody. Yeah, I really do hope that you were encouraged by this today, that maybe you were challenged again. Turn that view inwards and think through kind of how am I approaching this? Am I really staying strong to truth, making sure that testing teaching is important, but also recognizing that we should not be torching teachers? How do we sit down across from someone saying, I respect you enough to hear what you have to say? and I want to listen to you, and I want to challenge and respond and push back and have a good conversation, because that is going to be mutually edifying and beneficial for us. I think this is what we need, and hopefully what I'm encouraging and challenging you to do. And so if you've enjoyed it, share it, like it, spread it with others. I would greatly appreciate that. There's also going to be other resources that pop up on the side that can help you think deeply about other cultural issues, about theological issues, apologetic issues, so that hopefully you're prepared and trained to really go out and be the people that God has called you to be as ambassadors of Jesus Christ. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for joining this conversation. And I will see you again next week, as I discuss this short booklet, Does God Care About Gender Identity? That's the topic next week. And I will see you guys then. Until then, continue to think deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. Bye, everybody.